Some of you probably clicked on this video just because of the title and must be wondering, really, let's see where this is going, with the full expectation that the title was probably misleading. So here is the promise. Keep watching. The title is provocative but not misleading. And by the end, my hope is that you will learn enough to go, the title strangely makes sense. It's World War II. A Swiss chemist named Paul Hermann Müller discovers that a molecule originally synthesized by an Austrian chemist named Ottmar Ziedler is really good at killing bugs. Neurons have something called a voltage-gated sodium channel, which is a technical way of saying a switch that turns on and off using sodium and enables communication between neurons. Once a neuron fires, activates, there's a process that deactivates it. This molecule does something wicked. It prevents and delays the deactivations, causing the neurons to continuously fire, which is, to put it mildly, bad. It causes continuous spasms in the insects and kills them pretty quickly as they run out of energy and oxygen. In a few years, we're spraying this molecule everywhere to prevent infectious diseases spread by mosquitoes and to kill agricultural pests. But fast forward a decade and some terrible things start happening. Birds start dropping out of the sky. Their eggshells are as thin as paper. Fish are dying in lakes. And far up the food chain, the polar bears that eat seals, that eat fish, that eat other fish, are getting a massive dose of a toxin via a process of biomagnification. This is when Rachel Carson, a marine biologist, writes a book called Silent Spring, documenting unregulated pesticide use and its detrimental effects on the environment, particularly on birds. Carson argued that pesticides, especially like the molecule Paul Müller discovered, were poisoning both wildlife and the environment and also posed a serious threat to human health. The title Silent Spring refers to a dystopian future world devoid of bird songs, imagining a world where many birds have been killed off by these chemical pollutants. The book is widely credited with launching the environmental movement. Carson meticulously described how this molecule entered the food chain and accumulated in the fatty tissues of animals, including human beings, and caused cancer and genetic damage. A significant part of her book was dedicated to challenging the practices of agricultural science and the government, which she perceived as being too accommodating of corporate interests. The molecule's name was diphenyl trichloroethane, also known as DDT. And this story is familiar to almost all of us because we studied it in school. It's a cautionary tale of scientific hubris, of putting profits before humanity, putting human interests above the environment. Except there is another version of this story. It's World War II. A Swiss chemist named Paul Hermann Müller discovers that a molecule that is really good at killing bugs. Over the next few decades, it goes on to save millions of lives by killing malarial mosquitoes and saves millions of tons of food from being eaten by agricultural pests. In fact, in this particular country, whose name I'll tell you shortly, 800,000 people were dying from malaria every single year in 1950. By 1961, that number is a few thousand, thanks to this molecule. And it also increases agricultural yield by killing bugs that eat crops. It's a game-changing moment for that country. And then the Silent Spring book is published, and all of a sudden the West decides, oh my God, this is poison and we must ban it. And eventually we find out that it really does not damage DNA and is not as toxic as it was portrayed. And the West never takes into consideration that developing countries might have different priorities. Deaths from malaria actually started to increase once DDT was banned. Something that is morally wrong. What is a few birds and a few fishes in comparison to a single human life saved? Which version do you believe? Some of you will only believe the first version, and some of you will immediately identify with the second based on what your political ideology is. But those of you that don't hold very strong opinions on subjects you're not experts in, The fact is, both versions are filled with some fact, some exaggeration, some cherry picking of data, and a healthy dose of extrapolated opinion. For example, DDT was not as toxic as it was made out to be. At the same time, insects eventually developed resistance. The complexity of the real world is a maze of dry and contradicting facts and tons of data that are very hard to make sense. But we as humans navigated using simple stories, not data. Stories have themes and are built on patterns we recognize. The hero struggle, the underdog winning, truth triumphing in the end, good versus evil, corporate greed. And on the other side, the hypocrisy of the West, unrecognized privilege, and the power of the free market, and so on. Real life is just brutally random and often does not accommodate simple stories. And by the way, that country where DDT was game-changing in terms of controlling malaria and improving agricultural yield, India. Welcome to the uncomfortable reality of pesticides. And in this video, we will focus our attention on pesticides in food, not the ones used to kill mosquitoes, because my area of interest is food, not infectious diseases. Let's start with a bit of history, because many people believe that agriculture was clean and organic before chemical pesticides and fertilizers were invented in the 20th century. Not true. Human beings, as a general rule, don't like to starve. And one good way to do that is to prevent bugs from eating your food. The first recorded use of insecticides is about 4,500 years ago by Sumerians who used sulfur compounds to control insects and mites. Yes, the same stuff that influencers now claim is making our sugar toxic. While in ancient times, both the Chinese and Indians were using mercury and arsenic compounds for controlling pests. As there was no chemical industry, any product used had to be either of plant, animal, or mineral in nature and easily available. So, for example, one idea was to burn materials such as straw, crab shells, fish bones, cow dung, or even animal horns to make thick smoke that was spread through the field. The belief back then was the worse the smell, the more effective the pest killing ability. Many of these techniques were truly harmful to human beings, but the risk to crops was far more important as a consideration. Pyrethrum, which is derived from the dried flowers of chrysanthemum, has been used as an insecticide for over 2,000 years. In India, neem leaves are also used as a pesticide. Persians used chrysanthemum powder to protect stored grain. Likewise, many inorganic chemicals have been used since ancient times as pesticides, like copper sulfate and lime. What people forget is that in the 20th century, we used a better understanding of chemistry and biology to make molecules that were more effective and less toxic to human beings. DDT, for all the bad name it has, is way less toxic than the stuff we used to use in the past, like arsenic. That is why Paul Muller won the Nobel Prize in 1949. So the big question on everyone's mind: are pesticide residues in food a serious problem? This question has come about because of recent headlines involving spices. So let's ignore the headlines and actually dig into the details. Here's the basics of how this works. In a large and poor country like India, public policy choices, regardless of political ideology, have to be grounded in utilitarianism, meaning the greatest good for the largest number of people. Dams displace some people and cause environmental degradation. Dams also feed millions. Some dams will do more of the former and less of the latter, but most will deliver the greater good. The scientific argument should be about whether the logic behind how many people you affect is correct and whether you faithfully and accurately calculate and report the benefits and loss to the public. This is true for vaccines too. Vaccines prevent millions of deaths but might cause hundreds of deaths. So we have to use pesticides, but we deserve to know how much residue is left over and if that poses a risk to our health. Farmers apply pesticides at various stages of plant growth: pre-planting, at planting, at harvest, or after harvest. And the application could be based on environmental conditions like fungicides during damp or moist conditions, or the life cycle of a specific pest. They can add it to the soil, dust, or spray it. Spraying is the most common method. Typically, the earlier the stage, the less the concern, because the pesticide will degrade to harmless byproducts. That's how they are designed. The primary concern is from spraying before and after harvest. Normally, there is a pre-harvest interval that regulates how much time you have to wait after you spray before you can harvest. So in a country like India, with a large number of very poor farmers with very low levels of education, what can happen is, 1, you spray more than necessary. 2, you don't wait for long enough after spraying before harvesting. 3, structural incentives. If something is given for free or at a subsidy, it will be used more. But this is complicated. India cannot possibly make farmers pay for everything because of how hard it is to farm and the typical per capita incomes of farmers. And let's not forget, we cannot afford to lose crops to pests. And also, and I know this might seem obvious, farmers do not want to harm you. So long story short, by the time food gets to your grocery store, it will have some pesticide residue. So the next logical question, how much? Interestingly, in India, pesticide use peaked in the 1990s and has gone down since then, simply because the government changed the incentives. Subsidies were reduced, and once farmers had to pay more to use pesticides, they started using less. Just so we are clear, we were eating food with far higher residues in the 1990s than we are now. So to answer the question of whether the residues are high enough to be a serious health risk, I have with me Dr. Andrea Love, who is a biomedical scientist, a science and health educator, and the founder of Immunologic.
I'm Dr. Andrea Love, biomedical scientist. So when we talk about pesticides, people are often concerned about their fresh produce or their foods being contaminated with harmful levels of pesticides. So how much are we actually exposed to? Well, I think you'll be relieved to know that that level is very, very tiny.
In fact, this dietary risk assessment from the Food and Agriculture Organization in the United Nations on spices like pepper, cardamom, cumin, etc. eventually concludes that the pesticide residue levels are not a public health concern, meaning too low to be of worry.
For context, when you're getting food items, we're talking about trace residues in the parts per billion or parts per trillion. So that's 1 part of pesticide per billion parts of the other substance, or 1 part per trillion, which is 1 part per 1 trillion. So as an analogy, we'll use time. So 1 part per billion is 1 second per 31.7 years. So think about how small that value is. 1 part per trillion, even smaller. It's 1 second for 31,700 years. So these levels are minuscule. Now, I know that media headlines and clickbait can sound really scary, but the reality is that these levels, these parts per billion, parts per trillion, are not levels that are ever going to pose a health risk to you as a consumer. These pesticides are regulated by various scientific agencies. They're extensively studied so that we understand how they work, their mechanism of action, the levels at which they need to be regulated at, and the safety threshold. And so those safety thresholds are set orders of magnitude lower than any level that would potentially pose a risk to humans.
Then the other thing to keep in mind is how we set safety limits for these residues. Even when you see a headline that says exceeded safety limits by 8 times or something, you have to remember that those limits are typically 100 to 1,000 times lower than actual levels at which some harm was observed in animals like rats.
This contains red 40 food coloring. A child has to eat more than 100 of these a day to exceed the acceptable daily intake, which is more than 140 times less than the largest amount that caused problems in rats.
So of course, we don't want residues to exceed the levels we have defined, but is it something you need to get very worried about? No. Another common myth is that all organic farming is pesticide free.
One of the biggest misconceptions about organic products, though, is that they're pesticide free, and that's not the case. The only difference between organic farming and conventional farming when it comes to pesticide use is that organic farming uses organic pesticides, and this is not organic in the chemistry sense, this is organic as pesticides are labeled. But these are chemicals that are not synthetically altered from their source in nature. These would include things like nicotine sulfate, methyl bromide, copper sulfate, sodium hypochlorite, gibberellic acid, chlorine dioxide, peracetic acid, sodium carbonate peroxyhydrate, lime sulfur, azadirachtin, spinosad, calcium hypochlorite, veratrin D, lignin sulfonate, and so on and so forth. These are all chemicals. They're all pesticides. That suffix "sides" means that we're still killing things. So there's lots of things in nature that can be quite dangerous even at lower levels. If you believe otherwise, that's called the appeal to nature fallacy. So let's take a look at an example of some fungicides. So for example, copper sulfate is used globally as one of the most common organic fungicides. In fact, it's one of the highest quantity fungicides used in grape farms in places like France and Belgium. Copper sulfate not only is used at a higher quantity because it's less effective, but it also is more toxic at a lower dose. So we use a value called the LD50, which is the 50% lethal dose, meaning the level at which 50% of a group of organisms would be killed. And this is usually in animal models. So the LD50 of copper sulfate is 300 milligrams per kilogram. The synthetic alternative fungicide that is used in conventional farming, for example, one called mancozeb, has an LD50 of 11,200 milligrams per kilogram. So a lower LD50 means that you need less of it to have harmful effect. So this means that copper sulfate is at least 15 times more toxic than the synthetic alternative fungicide. In addition, copper sulfate in particular bioaccumulates more readily than many of these synthetic fungicides. It can also harm fish, non-fungal species, and it can also persist in the groundwater. So we don't want to have these misconceptions that organic pesticides are inherently safer or better, and in many instances they're actually ecologically worse and need to be used at higher levels.
Another common concern is that sure, even if the residues are really small, will they not accumulate in your body over the years?
Now, when we talk about, whether or not our bodies are accumulating pesticides, this really depends on the type of pesticide you're talking about. So most pesticides that are used don't actually have mechanism of action in people because they're specific to certain classes of organisms. Fungi, which are very different from human cells, or insects or arthropods, which are very different from us, or herbicides, plants are very different from people. And then on top of that, many of these are not what we call fat soluble. So they're not going to accumulate in our fatty tissue in our body, but rather they're going to be filtered out and excreted in our urine or our feces. So for the most part, we don't need to be concerned about accumulation of pesticides. Now, years ago, there were some pesticides, there were some substances that were used that were found to be bioaccumulants, something like chlordane and or DDT. These are a category of pesticides called organochlorine. Now, once it was determined that these did have further reaching effects than what they were intended, these substances were removed and actually banned.
Another common category of scaremongering is the dirty dozen list. A lot of health influencers in India use that list to scare people about what vegetables contain the most residues, typically things like cabbage and cauliflower, etc. And they keep asking people to buy organic as a reason.
When we talk about the Dirty Dozen list, which is a list created by an anti-science activist group called the Environmental Working Group, or the EWG. Now, the EWG has a long history of making anti-science statements, and in fact, they even previously claimed that vaccines were linked to autism, but they're largely funded by charitable donations from large industrial organic farms. So there's a conflict of interest and an incentive to drive their consumers to buy organic products, which in reality use more land, their yields are lower, and they cost nearly 50% more. Typically, organic farming uses 84% more land for the same yield, and the yields are on average 55% lower than conventional pesticides. And so the EWG is maybe one of the most egregious contributors to this preconception that organic products are superior. And so one of the ways they do this is they create this list called the Dirty Dozen. And every year they put this list out and it purportedly says which 12 produce items are contaminated with harmful levels of pesticides. Now, this is nothing more than a disinformation campaign. This Dirty Dozen list causes so much fear and anxiety amongst people, and it actually leads people to buy and consume less produce. They have been criticized for decades by scientific experts and toxicologists because they don't use legitimate scientific methods to make their assessments. They routinely exaggerate the risks of chemicals. They overstate the impacts to our health, and they take findings that don't have any physiological or clinical relevance, and they just exaggerate them to scare people. And they really exploit this concept of chemophobia, the fear of chemicals.
Now, let's specifically address spices, because that's been in the news recently. Curiously, it seems to have disappeared from the news and influencers' focus because, well, their interest seems to be to scream, "Oh my God," when it's fashionable because it gets you clicks and likes, but then move on to other things. And it works because the public memory is short and no one questions them. Hey, if you screamed danger last month, how come you're not saying anything now? Did the danger disappear in just a month? Or was it not really dangerous in the first place? That is why I decided to wait till that crowd moved on to make this video. That way, you're not distracted by a that versus this argument, but are able to say, now that the item song is over, can we get to the real story of the film? And in general, that is a good way to understand the complexity of the world. Never take social media trends and headlines seriously. Wait for a month and see if the story still has relevance. And by then, actual experts would have had time to communicate the detailed picture. So let's consider spices. Spices are very expensive and difficult crops to grow. They grow in very few places, and any loss to pests is devastating to farmers. So there are going to be some residues. So let's address the biggest myths here. 1. Influencers in the media were saying, buy whole spices and grind them yourself. How is this going to help? The pesticides are added during farming and the residue is there in the whole dried spice. The company you buy your masalas from is buying the spices whole and grinding, packaging and selling the powdered spices to you. Pesticides are not added at the grinding and packaging stage. 2. You could ask, surely these companies must clean the spices of residues before grinding. But unfortunately, there is no current industrial method to do that without losing most of the spices' aroma. And spices are all about aroma. When such a technology becomes available and affordable, it will get used. I repeat, no one, the farmer or a food company, wants to sell you stuff with pesticide residues, no matter how small. 3. Ethylene oxide was detected. This one is relatively simple. The European Union has banned ethylene oxide as a fumigant. So stuff that is exported there is not fumigated with ETO. Some other countries have not banned it because they are far more worried that foods from India will contain living larvae of bugs that can be invasive, so they expect it to be fumigated. The important thing here is that if you live in India, guess which country has banned ethylene oxide for domestic use? India. So stop worrying about this. And again, remember, despite the headlines of 1 or 2 countries banning some spices and so on, and let's not even get started on first world countries applying first world standards on our exports. As Dr. Andrea pointed out, the actual levels of residues are low. They are still 100 to 1,000 times less than the amounts that cause problems in rats. So when I say keep calm and consume pesticides, I am not asking you to literally eat pesticides. Don't do that. I am saying that keep calm when you see social media trends and headlines, because nuance usually arrives later. I am asking you to not fall for the cherry-picked narrative that it is a serious problem without actually looking into the data. So what I'm really saying is keep calm and consume pesticides because they are likely to be present in such tiny amounts in your food that no actual expert believes that you should worry at this point.
And then the last thing is that there's a lot of misinformation about, you need to remove pesticides prior to eating foods, or you need to detox your body. The reality is you don't need more than water to wash your produce. You don't need to spend extra money on all these detoxing cleaners for your foods. You don't need to do all these labor-intensive methods. You don't need soap. In fact, it's actually recommended that you don't use these things because it can compromise the integrity of the food, and it can make it more likely that they'll get contaminated before you have a chance to eat it. Unfortunately, we live in a society where clickbait headlines get more likes, get more traction, get more attention than the nuanced reality. But you should feel confident and safe that conventional food is very safe to eat. Our food supply is the safest it's ever been. And you should buy what looks good to you, what you can afford, and what is a part of your diverse diet and habits.
So just wash your vegetables and fruits and you will be fine.